Politicians, you vote them in, and more often than not, they leave you annoyed and disappointed. Just ask anybody in the UK right now watching the Brexit business. Is it time, therefore, for the MPs to let experts take over? Is a technocracy the answer to our problems? We'll be debating that on Roundtable with me, David Foster. Well, you know, they should have impressive CVs, they should have pretty much impeccable economic credentials, but they have no popular mandate to government. So-called technocrats are supposed to rise above the political bickering and drive through policies for the greater good. Do they?
Democracy is going through a difficult time. Disillusion with politics is rife. Is it time for a different or hybrid system? Can we be ruled by technocrats, and do they really know best? Democracy has lost momentum. Dramatic declines have been seen in every region of the world. Democracy watchdog Freedom House says 2017 was the 12th consecutive year of the downturn. 71 countries went backwards, more than double those that made any gains. Countries that a decade ago seemed like promising success stories, critics now say are sliding into authoritarian rule. In 2015, Myanmar was being celebrated for its transition towards democracy. But 2017 saw the renewed persecution of the Rohingya Muslim minority and the repression of journalists. And the land of the free is retreating from its traditional role as a democratic champion.
We saw a concerted effort by Russians to interfere with the 2016 presidential election. We have been quite concerned about the large number of lies and misstatements that have been made by the president and documented by independent fact-checkers. There's also been corruption, the mixing of business and public interests. These would be things that we would look at in other countries, and we are noting them in the United States.
Technocracy advocates argue the democratic system is unprofessional, overly politicised, corrupt and ineffective. A society managed by scientists and engineers would be more rational and productive. Singaporeans handed rule of their society to a one-party technocracy, and it's an economic powerhouse with the second busiest port and the third highest per capita income in the world. Ukraine's outgoing economy minister called technocracy the only hope for lasting change, 2 years after the 2014 revolution, when people were growing tired of the slow pace of reform.
I think we really need to use this opportunity to bring in a completely different, set of people with a completely different mindset.
In 2011, both Rome and Athens installed prime ministers with expertise in economics and finance to drive through tough austerity measures. Technocracy does have its proponents. Pew Research shows that while there's a global preference for representative democracy, the next best option is a system where experts, not elected politicians, call the shots. Praised as the answer to populism and political bickering, more often than not, technocracies are temporary solutions. Their skills complement whatever crisis a nation is facing, or they act as a caretaker until the next election. But with democracy under attack, can unelected experts rescue a faltering system?
Well, let us kick this off. Now I am surrounded by experts. None of them voted in. We just invited them to join us. First up, on Skype from Singapore, we have Nazry Bahrawi from the University of Technology and Design. From Adelaide in Australia, Michael Barr, a specialist in Singapore politics at Flinders University. In the studio, Spiekermann from the Department of Government at the London School of Economics, and Enea Desideri, a research analyst at Open Europe. No doubt, Enea, going to give us the lowdown on what's happening in Italy, or perhaps it will have changed within 5 minutes of this programme ending.
Absolutely.
We don't know. Nazry, let me come to you first in Singapore. How does the system work there?
Yes, Singapore, you can say it's a functioning technocracy in the sense that the people in power, the political elites, were trained not from the humanities or social sciences, but had their degrees or their first training in STEM disciplines. such as computer science, engineering, economics, and such. And so what you get here is an obsession with systems. And surely that is why Singapore has now decided to embrace Smart Nation as its big philosophy moving forward.
Okay, Michael, what do you think? Does it work well in Singapore? And are the technocrats, as labelled by Nazry, are they answerable to the public in any way?
Well, I wouldn't actually have said that technocracies need to be from the STEM disciplines. I mean, most of the early technocrats in Singapore were certainly engineers, and they did operate by systems and did a lot of damage to the education system as part of that. But, I mean, I would see it as being professionalism across the whole of the professions, relative freedom from vested interests and sectional interests, including the democratic electorate. Now, so the technocrats are fairly remote from the constituencies that they are supposedly working for, whether we're talking about the million-dollar bureaucrats in the civil service or the multi-million-dollar politicians who were almost all former bureaucrats in cabinet. And it has achieved a lot of success. It's one of the more successful technocratic examples in the world, I'd have to say that. And yet it's still loaded down with all of the baggage of vested interests and sectional interests, and in Singapore, race and class and all of those burdens.
You see, what I'm wondering, and by all means chip in as we bring this back to the studio, is how does it differ when you put an expert in charge of something to when you just put somebody in who has to consult experts? Because let's say you're running a Department of Health in the UK. It might be an idea, as we have had in the past, to have a doctor at the top of it. So what's the difference?
Well, I think the difference really is in how justified that form of government really is for us. So yes, it's true. I mean, it's often useful to consult experts and maybe occasionally even elect an expert into positions, and you might get good outcomes from that. But the really big question is, why should these people rule us? And a very convincing answer is because ultimately we, the people, chose them. But if someone else picks them for us, well then, I mean, the expertocracy or technocracy is just running wild and is completely decoupled from any democratic legitimacy.
But anybody who comes in to run a government department isn't going to know everything about it. Therefore, inevitably, they're going to have to hire in experts.
Well, there is certainly an argument to be made about expertise needing to be part of the decision-making process. The problem is not questioning whether some level of technocratic knowledge should be part of the decision-making. The decision should be, and I here very much agree with Kai, what kind of legitimacy these the people in government have. Essentially, you can have people elected that consult technocrats. They will base the decision also on the opinion of the technocrats, the experts, but will ultimately report to the people having been elected by the people. Or do you have technocrats who have not been elected by anyone? Of course, we were mentioning the success of technocracies in the past, but I would ask, how do we actually measure success in the first place?
Well, give us an example of what you think would be an example of success with a technocracy.
I don't know. I tend to believe that nowadays we very much tend to judge the success of a particular government or a particular society, if you want, in terms of whether it delivers from an economic perspective. So essentially, if it delivers economically for its citizens, then we consider that to be successful.
May I suggest a fundamental difference between appointing a doctor or a medical professional as the head of a hospital, or a professor indeed as head of a university, or a qualified pilot as to fly a plane, and having technocrats who are effectively self-appointed or co-appointed by other technocrats running a government? And that is that the people in politics are actually taking life and death decisions and life-changing decisions over the people in their care, and they are part of that. So that actually affects them. So, they are actually part of that process and can benefit from it. And they tend to be, and this is just human nature, absolutely blinded to their own self-interest and to their own prejudices.
Let me just read something to you here. I've got a chart. There's no point in me showing it to you, but I will quote from it. In high-income countries, many would consider non-democratic alternatives. Now, the percentage for experts is higher in countries such as Hungary, South Korea, Spain, Japan, Israel. Down at the bottom, you have countries such as Greece and Italy that have tried it, perhaps, and it hasn't worked. So why, Nazry, just to throw out an idea on this, why do you think people in countries that are doing pretty well already would still consider appointing experts, technocrats, whatever, rather than just elected politicians?
Yeah, I'll speak from the perspective of the Singapore public. And I think one of the reasons why they would want to prop up the idea of expertise is that you don't rock the boat when it's not sinking, right? And what you try to do here is that you want to continue getting better deals. I think that's why there is this reliance on expertise, at least in Singapore, from the Singapore perspective. But I also want to say something. The government realizing that there are certain trade-offs in this move to try to embrace expertise and technology has tried to establish liberal art colleges in Singapore. And that is an ironical move on the part of the government, because now the creation of the polymath have decided, have thrown out a group of people who are increasingly seeing the contradictions within the system itself.
Kai, what do you make of what I've just read out there?
Well, I think what we can see
that
here
in Greece and Italy, they think it's a terrible idea to have experts in charge, but in South Korea, Japan, what was the other one at the top? Oh, Hungary. Oh, Hungary's a different case, I think, perhaps.
Well, I mean, experience is an interesting thing here, right? So, I mean, what is an expert really? So we take experts to be people that are somehow particularly well educated to address one specific area. So, but now look at some examples. Let's take the economic crisis from 10 years ago. Most economists really did not anticipate and did not see this coming.
Yeah.
Why is that? Well, probably because they used similar models, similar assumptions, similar data sets. So just because you have experts or even a group of experts does not mean that you necessarily get good government. So it's often much better to have, input from diverse sources, and sometimes it's also necessary to have input from the population.
But does this not also show, perhaps, that people are dissatisfied with their current democratic model, that they don't think that's working, therefore it's worth giving something else a chance, and if you can trust an expert, well, why not have them in power?
Well, we live through an age where, everybody is questioning whether democracy is working. Yeah. So there's this great unease about democracy. The interesting question is, first of all, is there an alternative? I think there is no serious alternative. Instead, I think we have to fix our democracies. That would lead us into a different debate. I mean, maybe you should invite me again for that. But I think technocracy is not really the solution for that problem.
Do you consider yourself an expert?
Well, I consider myself an expert for some questions, but I would not like to take over the government.
Okay.
Building on what Kai was saying.
And then we'll talk about Italy.
Yeah, specifically, but before, I mean, I want to make the point that I'm not arguing that, in specific case, for example, Singapore, we could take, if a technocracy is working, that's necessarily a bad thing. The problem is, if a technocracy is not working and doesn't deliver, what do you do then? Because in a democracy, yes, it might be imperfect, but if things are not working fine, people have a way to say that and to, it's not that easy, but to change things. In a technocracy, how do you do that?
Are you saying it's only autocrats, dictators, or authoritarians who can appoint a technocracy?
Well, I don't know. Well, we have to think about. We have to think. I mean, we have to think about how, the way we have framed it so far. It looks like the technocrats would be essentially unelected.
Unelected, okay. Because there's also the position of sort of having a democratically elected government that then appoints technocrats. So they're democratically elected technocrats. Yeah, but then tell us what happened in Italy with
I think Italy,
the technocrats.
It's a very good case. Then again, it's also a particular case in the sense that Italian politics fits within the broader context of what is European Union politics. But in the Italian-specific case, we had in the past technocratic governments, and for one reason or another, instead of addressing the problem with democracy today, they've actually ended up worsening, at least from the perspective of the people and what people think about their political system, the problems that were already there.
So why do you think that is the case? And please, anybody else jump in on this?
Can I jump in and make a point here? As we speak about technocracy, we must not forget that technocracy is also a form of democracy. There are many different forms of democracy. The Singapore government would call itself a democratic society, even though we might classify it as a technocracy here. And so I think the point is to try to look at what kind of democracies we want. And maybe there are elements or universal principles that we should subscribe to. It's a philosophical point. But really, what are those principles? Human rights, freedom of speech, which some say would be missing in Singapore, or the pursuit of prosperity.
Enea, I'll come back to you in just a moment, just since we've gone over to the Far East. And Michael, can you think of ideas of autocratic, technocratic governments, if you like, appointed by a strong man or whatever, and properly democratic ones? Which way should we look?
In essence, no, I can't think of any examples like that. The technocratic governments that we've had have either been weak governments that have strong bureaucracies, or they are actually technocrats in government as the politicians, which is what you have in Singapore. Singapore likes to think, interestingly, Singapore's high point as a technocracy came just as Japan's was in decline. And that's the stage where they reached this model where they thought they had their professionals, their people with talent, all coming from the same social group and the same schools, both in government and in the military and in the civil service. And they were almost indistinguishable. And in Singapore, what you have is such a thoroughly technocratic system. It's not just in government. It's entrenched through the society, through the military, goes through the school system, and what it means is that you have an entire class of governing officials, whether politicians or bureaucrats, who are all from the same social set, who don't mix with the ordinary people, don't live in the same housing estates, don't catch public transport with them, and this is actually creating new problems.
That's authoritarian rule, is it not, Kai, in a sense?
I would describe Singapore as being an electoral authoritarian system. It is certainly authoritarian, and yet they maintain relatively fair elections on election day, but with every other part of the playing field being unfair and unlevel.
So the system there is that it's supposed to be democratic on the face of it, but in no ways is this technocratic government in Singapore really democratic, and the same might apply in any society that does that. Would you agree?
So, I mean, authoritarian rule comes in many forms. So I think the Singapore model, as far as I know it, is about basically shutting down effective opposition. In other countries, it comes by controlling the media, and in yet other countries, it comes by really very directly forming a sort of dictatorship. It seems to me that the Singapore model, in terms of economic output, in terms of some other measures, is of course doing well. But the problem with this sort of comparison is, I mean, you pick the best sort of autocratic regime and compare it with the average democracy. Well, not surprising that your best autocratic regime looks quite good. Take the average autocratic regime and ask yourself whether you want to live in that regime. And then I think you come to very different conclusions. You really want to be careful what you wish for. And any autocratic regime, even if it's currently working really well, can eventually collapse into something that is not working so well.
So would it be fair to say that, well, we'll get Enea's view on this, but I'm asking you since we happen to be talking at the moment, that a democratic technocracy is always going to fail, whereas an authoritarian technocracy can, at least on the surface of it, appear to be successful? Perhaps that's why Italy's failed.
I'm not sure. I think, in principle, representative democracies are, in a very weak sense, technocracies. So any good representative democracy will draw on experts. So if you go, I don't know what, you go to Berlin and you walk in the German Bundestag, you will find a group of parliamentarians quizzing experts about, you know, how they should make laws. And these experts will report and they will ask many of them, and in the end, the politicians have to make the decisions because they are our representatives and not the experts. But of course there has to be this interaction. I think the technocracy really starts in a stronger, meaningful sense when the experts take over and the politicians are in the backseat.
So what went wrong in Italy?
Well, what went wrong in Italy was essentially that partly because of external economic constraints, but focusing in this particular case on economics. Yeah, that essentially the technocrats were not perceived as being delivering for the people. So people had the perception that the economic situation was deteriorating. Now, whether that was necessary for the country as a whole, you know, particularly I'm referring now to the Monti government, so the last technocratic government. Well, that was necessary for the economy of Italy as a whole to survive.
And perhaps to rise above politics and show the outside world that this was being taken seriously.
Yeah, and the problem was that, according to the Italian people, the government was not delivering. And contrary to previous, you know, like to other governments, elected government, where you can say, well, it's not delivering, okay, we voted for it at least. That particular government had not been voted by anyone. It was for a time, you know, supported by parliament, yes, but in a situation where no political government was essentially possible. Of course, then in that case was like coming from the form of the Berlusconi's government.
If it was to be repeated, and there's a political chaos in Italy at the moment, if a similar game was to be played once more, could it succeed because we're not in perhaps such a dire global financial situation as before, or is it doomed to failure once again?
Well, I don't know. I mean, based on the reaction of the people, we're talking about just yesterday, the President of the Republic in Italy asked a technocrat to form a government. Now, it's very doubtful that he could actually win the confidence vote in Italian parliament. But regardless of that, there seems to be no appetite among Italian people for a technocratic government right now. I think the problem with democracy, and going back to what we were saying towards the beginning of the discussion, there is definitely a problem with democracy, but much of that, whether that's the case or not, at least the perception is on the part of the people that they are not having a voice in the current system. And if that's the case, I think technocracy is not giving an answer to the problem. Whether or not it's successful, it just risks worsening that perception among the people.
Michael, if we can come over to you again, because we've only got a few more minutes left. Where are we heading in terms of trends towards either the elected politicians picking and choosing and just getting advice, or the technocrats being in charge?
You'd have to say this is not a good time for democracy. Democracy is under challenge everywhere and has fewer and fewer defenders. Countries that have been champions of democracy are giving way to illiberalism and, frankly, to rank stupidity on occasions. And we have a rise of China where we have kind of a modern authoritarianism or authoritarian modernism, which is kind of a corrupted technocratic approach. And that is going from strength to strength. And it is becoming increasingly authoritarian and autocratic in the true sense of the word, with Xi Jinping's rise. While in Singapore, we have the technocracy stumbling on. I'd have to say that it's, I have to disagree with what was just said, that Singapore is actually not going so well. And they know they're not going well. They're facing a lot of challenges. And this is where technocracy starts to become difficult to manage, because contrary to expectations, it actually has trouble dealing with massive change. And America's democratic system is much more likely to have the flexibility than Singapore, where groupthink and vested interests have really sort of taken over, and the technocrats are increasingly isolated from the population.
Okay, Nazry, just round this off for us, because unfortunately we're coming to the end of this discussion. Right. What lessons should other people learn from watching what's been happening in Singapore?
So yeah, I do agree with what Michael has just said, but I do want to give a more positive twist to things. And that is to look across the causeway from Singapore into Malaysia, where an authoritarian government has actually fell, and a new government with new hope, when emerging democracies is now in power.
Well, thank you all very much indeed for joining me on this edition of Roundtable. I tell you, another way to end is perhaps to quote Winston Churchill's contention about democracy, that it is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Many true words spoken in jest, and I'm not sure he was jesting there. From me, David Foster, and from all of our experts here, however much you trust experts or not, thank you very much for watching this edition, this programme, Roundtable, and we hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.